I'm quite worried about the passivity that comes from the internet age or the social media age or our dependency on phones and algorithms and all these little things. I think about this a lot. We are becoming very passive, and I think this is a big problem. Normally, when we think of education, because in a way, all the information that we receive from the internet, from our phones, from these screens, from this screen you're looking at right now, all this information, even if we don't consciously think about it, it is educating us. Meaning it is shaping the way in which we think about the world, and in ways that, I think we need to be more conscious about. So, when we think of education, we normally think of the school system. In the school system, there is a unidirectional flow of information coming from a single source, and the information is heavily curated in a way that creates a framework for the formation of core identity among its kind of student body. And I'm not talking necessarily about college because it's a bit of a different thing, but say, for example, in lower grades, when people are still children. So this is because of the shared information that is presented and given to the students for them to process in their minds and to be tested on. It creates a shared identity among a student body. Such as when I meet someone from one of school from back in the day, I have a stronger connection with that person because we have a stronger shared foundation or body of information that we had to process and accept and regurgitate in education and the education system that we went to. This is the same thing that is true with national education. So, for example, propaganda, nationalist propaganda. Some of us don't realize, for example, that the ways in which we understand our own countries were heavily curated by the people in charge of our countries, because they want us to understand the world in a way in which it looks at the country that we're in as kind of the good guys, or as you want the people who live in your country to be on the side of your country in terms of international disputes, in terms of historical disputes. And so in some sense, we are also shaped in that way through the news, through whatever our presidents say on television that we have to listen to. All this stuff is, in a way, again, about shaping our minds. Educational systems, religious institutions, if, say, for example, you go to a certain church, you literally have a single source of information, a priest, interpreting a piece of scripture in a way that is unique to that church. So every church has, in a sense, someone who is telling them one way of looking at the things in the world, and how to process the world and how to process the text. And so people who share the same church end up becoming shaped in a certain way, even minutely, in terms of how they think about the world. Now, the benefit of this type of situation is that there is an object, there is a source that we can kind of easily point to. Okay, so if I disagree with a certain aspect of what I'm learning or being taught, I can say, okay, well, I disagree with that person. I disagree with that group of people in the school. Maybe when you get out of the school, you get out of the school system, you go out into the world, you experience more things, you realize, okay, I don't think some of the things I learned still resonate with what I've learned further on. And because of the situation, I can now change the way I think, or at least modify it in a way that is that accepts more of the information that is new. And so I become, I evolve, I develop, I become a new kind of person. It's easier because there is a source of information that I can look to, that I can say is individually, if not flawed, but not as kind of broad as I thought it would be, or not as applicable to my life's experiences as it would be. Now, what happens is that when you have a source of information that you can more consciously and actively resist, it's a more active process, and I think you have it creates a sense of control over the information that you have and the direction that you want to move into. If, say, for example, again, I receive this information, I know where it came from. When I realize some of the flaws of that person's argument coming from maybe that person or that institution's background, I can say, okay, I understand why you said this or why you taught me this, but it doesn't agree with what I now know. Therefore, I can more consciously and actively resist it and move on to another direction. The problem with the internet age and with social media is that a very large percentage of the information that we receive comes from sources that are more murky. It's not as clear. It's not like a specific pastor or a specific teacher telling me something that I know is ideologically bent in a way that doesn't agree with me. The sources of information are a bit of a mystery for the individual person, because a lot of the time we receive information. Say, if I open my feed on Facebook, or you can look at Twitter or something, Instagram, and the collection of information that is presented to you is, again, it's algorithmically designed so that you will want to you'd agree with it already, or you'd heavily disagree with it, but it's set up in a way that if I find some random piece of information on my social media feed, I don't know exactly where it's from. Or sometimes it's difficult to know where it's from. So it's difficult to know how to resist it. And therefore, it becomes easier to just accept it. And there is, less of, why should I resist the information if many of the people who are in my circle share the same algorithmic push as I do? We have the same things are shown on our feeds in the same way. In fact, that is how we kind of create more identities in online communities these days. We become friends with people and then actually becoming friends with someone, and we all kind of influence each other's feeds in a way. I'll post something, if you like it, now you'll see more of that thing. But the source of the information, or the ideological or the propagandistic motivations, are a bit lost. Ideological motivations. Often, every piece of information, I would think, most pieces of information have an ideological bent. They come in the form of wanting to present a version of things that may not necessarily be the entire version of things, but is one strong version of things, or are meant to mislead, or there are always things going on behind it. It's not necessarily just with the information itself, but sometimes in the way it's presented, in the words that are used. I'm very conscious about language, so the way people present an idea, even if it's the same idea, can heavily influence how one psychologically thinks about something. Anyway, so the sources of these forces, these ideological and propagandistic forces, are not clear. And so because there's not a clear source, it's difficult, if not impossible, to outwardly resist. And if the people in our circles are receiving the same information, I cannot publicly resist it, because it perpetuates this kind of sense of ignorance, right? And and what ends up happening is that if back in the day we had school, and the school tests us in information, if we don't get the right information, we don't regurgitate the right information, we get a failed mark in class. Now the stakes are much higher, where the fail in the regurgitating of information has a stronger impact on our lives. You can kind of post the wrong information, or the information that is not accepted by your circles, or the circles that most matter in your environment, and you can be, canceled, or you can be heavily, kind of bombarded with threats or whatever it is. But the stakes are much higher. Therefore, to outwardly resist the information that is being received by the people in your kind of ideological algorithmic circles, or the people who matter to you most in your profession in terms of power, you cannot outwardly resist it. Therefore, it induces a passivity. And whether or not the individual is actually passive, or is only presenting passivity by not actively resisting the source of information, at the end of the day, you see what's on your feed. And without much resistance to whatever information it is, it doesn't have to be any specific thing, but without active resistance towards certain forms of information, one assumes everyone else is passive. And therefore, even if we're not individually passive, we present passivity, which at some point, is there really a difference? So the problem, I think, with all of this is that it induces a lot of passive behavior on the internet. And passive behavior, or passive ways of thinking, once we disconnect the ideological, propagandistic, disconnect the informational thrust of certain things that we receive, it becomes as if we are in school, except we don't know who the teachers are, and the stakes of failing are even higher than ever, so we have to accept all the information that are in our algorithmic circles. Now, our algorithmic circles can be from any direction, but it's difficult sometimes to know the thrust of it. All we know, if you want to kind of go in that direction, is that at the back end of it, the reason why we're being thrust certain things is because companies are trying to maximize profitability by keeping our attention solely on these screens, on these kind of receptors of information. We're the receptors of information, but spreaders, the sources of the what do you call it? The intermediary of information, intermediary systems of information. So it kind of doesn't matter whether or not you're active or passive on the perspective of the companies that have these algorithms, because they benefit either way, because they are making money from how much time we're spending on these things. The problem, I think, what worries me is younger people who perhaps have never actually encountered having a very strong sense of kind of a little circle of unidirectional information that they can actively resist and actively form their own identities out of, because of an awareness of where the perspective comes from. This is such a big part of individual development. The idea that, you go through this propagandistic process of receiving information and at some point realizing, okay, now I can break out of this thing because now I have more information, and you can shape your own perspectives on the world. But now that initial development of because even within the educational system as unidirectional information, you are trained to increase reason or logic because the systems of thought are often internally consistent, if not internally consistent if not externally consistent, they are internally consistent. And you're taught to kind of develop rationality and logic and reason. These tools in which you can actually, the tools that will also help you break out of it when you leave the educational system and move out into the world. But now, at such a young age, the majority of the information you receive is already kind of in the throes of just chaos. And I really worry about it. I don't know what's going to happen to the future people or the current generation of people who, especially now with COVID, everyone's stuck at home. There's more of a higher dependency on these, these receptacles of information that who knows what they're showing. And it's more difficult to feel active in its resistance. And it sucks because I think in today's day and age, I think the internet is actually quite incredible. I'm very lucky to have grown up in this age, because the access to information is absolutely, it's everything. There's such a democratization of information, such as I'm aware that that there's so much of the information that I can receive comes from these sources of information that, again, I cannot actively resist, or sources of information that have propagandistic elements that I will probably be more passively inclined towards if I just remain on them. I can choose what information to receive by reading books, by by actively engaging with individual thinkers, by thinking about the world in a way that, by forcing myself to continuously actively think and consciously resist. And I don't know, there's many implications of all this stuff. For example, it's deteriorating it's not just deteriorating the individual's identity, it's deteriorating our attention spans, it's deteriorating our sense of our hold to truth, because now it's extreme skepticism. So much of what kind of can make someone develop a decent sense of well-being is completely deteriorated now. As we can see from the seeming increase of mental health issues with people of a certain age, because now it's just the world is in such utter chaos, and it's hard to know what the truth is, who to trust. I'll just kind of passively give myself up to algorithmic kind of popcorn, and that becomes the easiest response, and that increases passivity in a way that makes it easier for certain systems of power to be maintained, to increase inequalities that now can perhaps come from the people who have more control over the sense of attention versus people who have already lost that, or have never developed that ability, the ability to focus on things, create all these little big inequalities, and I worry about it. I really think that it's going to be the problem of the future, or if not already of the present, and COVID is not helping that in any way, and there doesn't seem to be any counter-hegemonic force that is going to push things in that direction, in the direction of more active participation in the world and ideas and thinking. And it worries me a lot, really.